The first one, I think, will go to Simon. How can local government land managers and planners access the Berry tool?
That's a really good question, and that is a challenge that we're starting to address, and we're going to be focusing on a lot over the next couple of years. We're basically sort of partway towards developing cloud computer-based capability for deriving not just that indicator that I was talking about, but all of our indicators. And we have a lot of interest from one of the big global tech companies. I won't name them here, but we will be building on that over the next year or two to basically get to a point where anybody can prepare the necessary input data sets, the biological data, the environmental layers, the ecosystem integrity or condition inputs that are required. So long as they are in the right formats, then they will be able to derive our indicators, including the berry, from those.
Thank you. Okay, now we have one for Rodney. What 3 key things would you recommend to a local group should do to commence an effective crossing structure for small birds?
Small birds. Don't build the road would be one. I think if I'll broaden the question out to, how do you have a campaign, I suppose, to where to build some crossings for wildlife on an existing road. I think that's where it's going, but specifically for birds. So I think the first thing is to figure out where the animals are getting killed. So that's collecting data about that. Keep in mind, though, that there may not be animals getting killed anymore because they've just all been killed over the past X number of years. So the actual mortality rates might be really low, but it might be the highest priority location. So you can't use just roadkill data alone. If it's more than just small birds, think about human safety aspects. So if there's some kangaroos involved, you can get the local government or the local council or this, depending on the road. If it's a big road, you can get the state government agency sort of involved from a human safety perspective and get funds through that avenue rather than a conservation avenue. Depending on the road type, you can reduce the speed. You can't do that on an arterial road that's 100 k's. If the road is designed for 100 kilometres an hour, you cannot reduce the speed because that's when you start to introduce collision hazards. So cars slow down when the car behind you doesn't realise why you're slowing down, and that's how you end up with collisions. It's about keeping vegetation close to the road so that the gap is smaller, because for many small birds, it's not actually the traffic, it's actually the gap that's causing the problem. Ideally, though, there'll be an underpass, like a bridge, if a riparian habitat that the birds will be flying along. You need to use a big bridge to get over that so the birds can fly underneath. Land bridges are also really good. So if you've got the vegetation growing on the land bridge, that will attract the small birds and get them across the road. Sorry, that's about 6 things. I hope that's okay.
That sounds good. We'll keep moving around the thing. Magnus, are kangaroos, wallabies considered candidate herbivores?
Yes, certainly. But there is so much we don't know about. As I said, we have undertaken a review of 10 case studies. But as I said, there is so much unknown about actually how this whole thing works. When it comes to kangaroos, I think you need more lingos. Huh?
Yeah.
Actually. That's where you actually get the impact. So the kangaroos is the herbivore, but you need then dingoes to reduce them. So that's, I think, what you need to do here.
Fantastic. Eamon, danke in my language for your wonderful presentation. This is from Ellie. My question is if the Te Kawara Waiora report is an internal or publicly available document.
Well, that's an easy one. Yes, it's available. Bit of an oversight on my part. It's available on our website, reconnectingnorthland.org.nz. So downloadable copies can be found there. Easy.
Yeah. Okay. Jamie, I think there's a couple for you. Jamie, do you have concerns with the Queensland Government's recent announcements to include dams in their energy strategy? I wonder what the answer to that might be.
I actually have an unhealthy obsession with hydropower dams and pump storage hydropower dams in particular. I think that anything we do to transition to renewable energy involves building stuff, and there are going to be inevitable environmental impacts and trade-offs. So for all of us who love, for example, solar and wind, converting to solar and wind involves building a lot more transmission lines, and that raises big concerns in terms of things like corridor conservation and fragmentation. Relying on renewable energy requires electrical energy storage. We're kidding ourselves if we think that batteries are going to do the job. We need big, long-duration storage, and unfortunately, pumped storage hydropower is the only off-the-shelf technology available to do that. So the question is, should we be concerned about the two massive pump storage proposals the Queensland Government's considering? Yes, we should be concerned to minimise the impact of any of those sorts of developments, but the two sites that they have chosen to explore further, to my mind, are relatively low impact from what is known at this point in time and before they've done the detailed surveys on the ground. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that they are really, really big. And so if they don't build these really big ones, they're going to have to build, on average, 10 smaller ones. And I think I would rather trade off some environmental impact at 2 sites rather than similar environmental impact at 20 sites.
Interesting point. Absolutely. So there was 2 questions for me. I might just pop them in quickly. One was how long does it take to train a detection dog and what's the cost effectiveness of them? Regarding the cost effectiveness, it depends on the project. So jobs for dogs, dogs for jobs. They're not always the right tool, but they can be extremely effective. They're probably at their peak when other traditional survey techniques are failing or struggling. Cryptic, small, low numbers, hard to find, lack of visual evidence, playing into that olfactory space, using noses, some of the reasons why dogs are really cost effective. They take time, so depending on the dog, and Raman has dogs and as well, and we probably maybe all have slightly different thoughts on this. But if you're starting a puppy from scratch, you're probably 12, 18 months to teach it everything that it needs to know so that it's safe in the environment. It has a proper search pattern, it has the odour recognition, and all of the other things it needs to be an effective in the tool. But once they're trained, then they're very efficient and very cost effective. So there's an upfront cost, but they're very cost effective to run afterwards. If you've got a dog that's really well trained and already field effective, then it can be anywhere from a month, 2 months to 6 months, depending on how difficult the odour is to put new odours on dogs. And if you've got other, certainly talk to Raman in the break because she's an expert in this field. Okay, so where are we up to? Okay, so we've got a broad one here that's when aspiring for viable populations, given a broad goal of demonstrating ecological connectivity, any tips on setting meaningful thresholds for this metric? Open to the floor.
Why don't I start on freshwater?
Why don't you? Take it away.
Yes, absolutely yes. So there's a simple metric which is the number of river kilometres that don't have barriers. One of the few things the New South Wales government has done on freshwater conservation that is really useful is to actually audit their rivers and identify each of the barriers and enable prioritisation of those that are redundant or unsafe and can be removed, and how many kilometres that connects up. It's then fairly readily possible to measure the changes in fish population. So for river connectivity, yes, the number of free-flowing kilometres and things like the population of fishes can be done.
Any other comments? No? Okay. Magnus, another one for you. How much degraded land would need to be revegetated or restored to increase healthy grasslands to achieve 500 gigatons of CO2 removal?
That was a
Just a really quick maths.
that was a quick and difficult one. Yeah, grasslands, I think generally are underestimated when it comes to carbon. Actually, the soil is extremely important for carbon storage. But I couldn't really give you a good answer to how much grasslands you need to restore 500 gigaton. But no, so I can't really tell that. But grasslands generally are underestimated. So, and like the ocean, the marine systems are also very much underestimated. So we talk a lot about forest, but I think grasslands is on the terrestrial side very important.
Okay. Rodney, one of our participants would like to hear your reflections on the challenges of funding fauna retrofits for existing road infrastructure, high cost and difficulty.
That's a great question. I think perhaps my biggest frustration, so I used to be in a university doing research and now I'm with a consulting company. And the biggest frustration is when there's a proposal for a particular project and you have to mitigate the impacts of that particular project on that particular project. But a kilometre away is another road which is having a much bigger impact. But you can't use, we have to mitigate the project that's currently under consideration. So I guess my point there is the existing road network is probably having a much greater impact collectively than the individual projects that we're currently proposing. So how to do it, like I said before, if we can identify where the problems are and if there's a human safety aspect, that's one way to do it. The other way is to lobby. So I've done a couple of projects for local governments where the local member has instructed us to fix the problem at a particular location, even if it was just a few ducks getting killed. But that's because they keep getting letters from people saying, I'm seeing lots of ducks killed on my bit of road, what are you going to do about it? And if they keep getting those letters and those messages, that's one way to get that across the line. And then it's a prioritisation process. So there'll be locations where it might be really, really important and necessary, but it's just very expensive. For example, you can't just lift a road over lift it up to put a culvert underneath without affecting 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 metres of road leading up to that point to build it up and over. So even though it's a really important location, it's just way too expensive. There's probably some easy wins somewhere else that will at least get you on the way. The other thing is, if you go for the really hard and expensive one and it's not very successful, good luck trying to get them to do another one. So picking some easy wins to start with that you can demonstrate success is a really good way to get people on board. The council or the government, the state agency might be willing to do it again if you can give them some good news stories. So there's a bunch of things in there, I think, to think about.
Thank you. Tim, Bryce asked, could you please repeat and further explain your comment on 7 million hectares cleared since 2000 and 93% avoided, the EPBC Act?
Sure. So there was an analysis carried out 2 or 3 years ago involving WWF and many others, looking at, number one, how much threatened species habitat has been cleared across Australia since 2000 and how much of it was actually referred to the minister or the federal government under the EPBC Act. And the answer to the question was approximately 7 million hectares of threatened species habitat. I think the vast majority of it in Queensland, and 90 or just 7% of that land area or that clearing was referred under the EPBC to the minister. So theoretically, given that it was known or suspected threatened species habitat, it should have all been referred if it was over a particular threshold of size, and I think the vast majority of it was. But the fact that so little of it was referred was just a sign that we have this EPBC law and it's failing. And it was used as a really strong statistic in the Samuels review, as well as in the State of Environment report that was released very recently. I hope that answers the question.
Rodney, another one for you. I've heard that some crossing infrastructure glider poles are now being utilised by predators, e.g. feral cats, to target crossing for wildlife. Any data on this?
I would be surprised if I didn't get that question. Whenever we do presentations like this is always what comes up. I remember one particular occasion I was downloading photos from a canopy bridge in central Victoria. My laptop went flat, so I had to go to the pub for 3 hours to charge it, which was a tough afternoon. I then had to go back out. That was even tougher. But while I was there, the publican was saying, oh, yeah, my mate's a truckie and he saw some, owl sitting on the edge of the bridge eating all the possums as they come across. And I didn't, maybe it was the couple of beers I had, but I didn't realise at the time, I didn't think to ask him, okay, so the truck driver's going past, it's up there on the side, your lights aren't hitting it. No, it was eagles, that's what it was. It was eagles eating the possums. And it's like, it just doesn't make sense with a nocturnal and a diurnal animal. Anyway, the point is, there is no systematic evidence, and there has been a number of reviews around the world that predation will negate the positive benefits of crossing structures. Yes, predators use these structures. We also internationally want to look after the predators. Yes, prey items use them. Yes, occasionally an animal will get eaten. But if it's well designed and well managed, it doesn't. It's not a problem. But having said that, predator control programs in Australia for foxes and cats should include these locations around the crossing structures, because we're investing potentially $3 or $4 or $5 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's not much when you're building an 8-lane freeway. We can spend a little bit of money to do predator control to increase the rates of use, particularly in the period when we're waiting for the vegetation to grow. If you put furniture in there, you've got logs and rocks and little pipes and things like that for the animals to use. That's going to be quite sufficient at reducing the rates of mortality.
Thank you. Eamon, there was a question for you that came up on the screen that I've just lost for the moment. Is it? Oh, good. Can you elaborate on bottom-up, top-down engagement in your project and how non-Maori New Zealanders engaged in the Maori concepts of a human environmental relations?
Good question. So what I didn't mention, I didn't want to get into our whole strategy because it would consume too much time. But one of our core strategies is as a what we call a connectivity catalyst. In other parts of the world, field catalyst, orchestrator, this is part of sort of a global, I suppose, movement in the area of collective impact, if you like. So as a connectivity catalyst, excuse me, our role in Reconnecting Northland is first and foremost to understand what the values are and the motivations are on the ground. So what I talked about today is just one example within Indigenous communities around stories of the land, ancestral stories, as inspiration and drivers for initiatives. The other side of the coin, if you like, so that's bottom up, an example of bottom up. On the other side of the coin is what's happening within agencies that is actually working. What's happening within, when I say agencies, government or providers, that is actually beneficial, and identifying what those key things are and taking the best of bottom up and the best of top down and figuring out what, how those two things or multiple things sort of intersect to enable greater socio-ecological outcomes. In terms of the second part of the question, non-Indigenous communities engaging with Māori, it's an interesting space. I think similar to what Rachel had said earlier, there's a growing interest, if you like, but there's not necessarily a strong comprehension of how that's done. I don't see that personally as a problem. I don't think non-Indigenous people need to understand some of the stuff. I think the opportunity really is about getting in behind First Nations, Māori, whomever it is, allowing them to lead, not enabling, just supporting. They already know what needs to happen. They already have the knowledge from, intergenerational knowledge, occupation, I suppose observation through occupation is another way of putting it. Getting in behind their movements is probably the most important thing. We within Reconnecting, we're not an Indigenous organisation. I've been asked a number of times by my board whether or not we should become a Māori organisation, for example. That's not even in the question because we're not a Māori organisation. We're a connectivity catalyst. Our role is to play that the middle ground, to figure out what are the key sort of interventions that will enable movement from one place to the next on the kind of in the connectivity dimension, if you like. Hope that answers your question, wherever you are.
Thank you. Simon, back to you. Anonymous is wondering if we are yet in a position to assess if what we are doing is working with some of these indicators and metrics.
No, in terms of outcomes for biodiversity, probably not. We're going to need a longer period of time to be able to do that, or observations over a longer period of time. But the closest we've come to being able to test at least some components that underpin the indicator are things like using the fossil pollen record. We had a really interesting collaboration some years ago now with a group in the US who have an incredible fossil pollen record stretching back 20,000 years, and we basically used a lot of the same modelling techniques that the berry indicator relies on to basically take data from one time point within those 20,000 years and then make projections forward or backwards based on the models that were fitted at that point in time, and those projections held up remarkably well, and where they didn't hold up, there were some reasonable explanations for why that was a particularly hard problem to to solve because of something that occurred within the system at that point. But overall, that evaluation was really encouraging. So if anyone wants the link to that paper, I can provide it to them.
Fantastic, thank you. So we have another anonymous open question. I think I know where it's going to go. Would evapotranspiration of water be balanced by forest watersheds generating more rainfall? You don't have to answer this one. We can give it to someone else.
Okay, so yes, if you replant a cleared landscape on a large scale, the evapotranspiration has moisture into the atmosphere and that generates rain. And so if we regenerated a lot of Eastern Australia, that would probably be fabulous for Eamon in terms of providing more rain in New Zealand. I don't think it's... Or for hydropower, true. I don't think it's going to do a lot of good here. The largest restoration program in the world was the Loess Plateau in China, and there's no substantial evidence of increased rainfall as a result of that. So there is this trade-off between planting trees in some parts of the landscape and the river. I was bailed up at afternoon tea to say, you know, this is terrible in terms of the wet tropics. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that in some particular parts of the landscapes, in the temperate mid-latitudes, in the higher rainfall zones, more water will be transpired than is good for the river system. So the way the Australian government's approached that in the past is saying that if below the 600 millimetre a year isohyet, the landscape's too dry, that rainfall and runoff is too erratic to worry about that. So restoration, go for your life, plant what you like. And above that, under the carbon farming law in Australia, it's meant to be regulated, but the way those regulations have been set up is essentially designed to fail. I think that was too blunt a law too, so it doesn't make sense to me to regulate restoration in the wet tropics where there's so much rainfall that the bit that the trees transpire is not going to matter. Similarly, in the wet dry tropics where all of the rain falls in 3 to 5 months, again, probably doesn't matter. What we need to focus on is the mid-latitude temperate zones in higher rainfall. There are a number of practices around the world that have been put in place to try and regulate that. So in South Africa, tree planting is regulated as a stream flow interception activity. And you can't plant a forest unless you buy a water licence to account for the water your trees use. That might be going a bit too far in our case. I do think that this is an instance where our friends at CSIRO might be useful in terms of... meant very nicely, meant in terms of scanning the landscape and looking for those bits in the landscape where planting trees is going to have a lower impact on runoff. There are opportunities to use things like taxes. South Australia, for example, levies a fee on pine plantation owners for the water that their trees use. There's a number of ways in which we can manage this problem. But we can't pretend it doesn't exist. Drying up our rivers in southeastern Australia is not a great climate change adaptation measure.
Cool, thank you. We've probably got about 5.
One more question.
One more question? All right. Tim, EPBC review is only at referral stage. But by then, land acquisition has happened, e.g. a high-speed rail through the border ranges. How do we stop this?
It's a very good question. I think we move as quick as we can with the EPBC reform. I think there's some really positive wheels in motion with the new government. There's obviously a balance needs to be tread because this stuff needs to be done well. The previous government was trying to fast track it, but not fast track it in a good way. They wanted to fast track decentralisation of states and be done with it. So we want to put sufficient rigour in place to make sure that things like the weakness around compliance and enforcement that I pointed to previously in relation to the failure to refer and act upon is dealt with, and that brings in a whole range of other different things. So I don't think we can rush it through too much, but it's got to move relatively quickly. But I think there's got to be other measures to deal with developments that are unsustainable. So it's one instrument, one tool, but it's not the only thing. I'm sure Jamie and others have more to add.
But if I could respond, the failure of EPBC to regulate things like land clearing or high-speed rail is not due to the provisions of the Act. EPBC can and has been used to regulate land clearing, only 7% of it. The failure to apply it to the other 93% is due to things like guidelines and procedures that have been adopted subsequent to the parliamentary passage of that law, the lack of political will to actually use it, the lack of funding for the Federal Environment Department to actually use the full environmental powers that they have. All the legal provisions are there if a government chooses to use it. Can I challenge us as an audience and say that I think the greatest problem is that we, those of us interested in the environment, haven't actually created the political will for our political leaders to actually apply the law they have. Yes, we can get a new law. It still depends on money to employ public servants to implement it. It still depends on ministers making decisions, and unless that political will's there, no law is going to be perfect.
I think that's a point at which we'll draw this to a close. Please join me in thanking the presenters for the session.